So just how is Australia as a nation shaping up post the mining boom? A short time ago, I caught up with Reserve Bank board member Dr. John Edwards from Canberra. Dr. Edwards is adjunct professor in the John Curtin Institute of Public Policy at Curtin University and served for over a decade as chief economist for HSBC in Australia and New Zealand, and before that as chief economic advisor to Paul Keating. John Edwards, how would you describe the state of the nation as at June 2015?
Well, I'd say two things. One is that growth is not fast enough. It's not fast enough to reduce unemployment, and I think that that's important. We need faster growth, which probably means we need stronger investment. But having said that, there are also some good signs. That is, growth has held up surprisingly well. It's above 2%. Employment has been quite strong in recent months, and in fact the unemployment rate fell in the most recent numbers. But above all, we're seeing really good strength in exports, and not just in mining exports, but also even in parts of manufacturing. For example, exports of machinery are at a new high, farm exports at a new high, and most importantly, I think, we're seeing a big increase in service exports.
And are we competitive enough, do you think? Is the Australian dollar low enough?
Well, I don't think it is low enough. I'd like to see the Australian dollar lower than it is. But it's also true that we're increasing our competitiveness, and we're doing it because, of course, the Australian dollar is lower than it was, but secondly because wages growth has been very low, and we've been seeing quite good increases in labour productivity. So those factors put together with a relatively low rate of inflation here means that we have over the last couple of years become very much more competitive than we were.
You argued in your book Beyond the Boom almost a year ago today that the mining boom was overstated in terms of the impact that it had on the economy, that we didn't actually waste the boom.
Yes, I think, in fact I think the experience since that book was published, as you say, a year ago, has been that we are making a reasonably good adjustment. As I say, growth, if you annualise the last 6 months, very nearly 3%. Very, very strong exports, as I mentioned, and in recent months, reasonably good employment growth. It's true that income growth has fallen, although even if you take, for example, household income, and you deflate it by the consumer price index, we've still had some increases over the last year, so it's not falling.
But our rate of income growth is falling. Interest rates are as low as they are for a reason, presumably. Isn't the problem that, as a country, we haven't got the confidence to spend and invest?
Spending, I'm not sure that's true. In terms of household consumption, it's actually running faster than GDP growth. So that argues that the downturn in income growth hasn't affected consumers in quite the way expected. It's certainly true that investment is slow, and it needs to be much stronger if we're going to grow much faster than we are. Of course, a lot of that's in mining, where it's expected. A lot of it's in manufacturing, where there's a lot of structural change. Interestingly, in the services sector, over the last year, investment has actually increased, and quite strongly.
Now, the services sector was supposed to pick up after the mining boom. Is growth in services happening as fast as it needs to?
I don't think you could have expected to see faster rate of growth of services investment than you've seen over the last year. It's around about 14% in real terms, which is really huge. And it's also true in terms of growth that the industry composition of Australian growth is led by services. Finance and insurance, for example, are leading growth. So I think we are seeing quite a big contribution from services, in employment, of course, but also in output.
There have been calls by Treasury for business to find its animal spirits. On the other hand, rates are low and they're bound to go up, and asset prices at the moment are very toppy. Were you surprised by the low response?
Well, I guess I would like to see more business confidence, and I think there are grounds for greater business confidence, and perhaps business is still looking for returns that in the current environment of low interest rates are too high. So I think that's quite concerning, the outlook for business investment. It's not all that responsive to lower interest rates. What I think may affect business investment in the longer term is if interest rates remain sufficiently low to sustain the growth of demand, that investment will then respond.
So you think that business investment will actually get going?
Oh yes, I do expect to see an upturn in business investment. Certainly not in mining, which has got quite a way to fall. Probably not in manufacturing, although that may stabilise. But I would expect the upswing in services sector investment to resume.
RBA Governor Glenn Stevens is clearly now worried about housing in Sydney. Of course, the drops in interest rates have helped fuel this. Are you disappointed that the drops haven't done very much for confidence?
Well, my sense, Dickie, is that actually interest rates have been very effective over the last year. They've been effective in helping us to get a markedly lower dollar. They've been effective in sustaining a rate of growth of consumption which is reasonably high. And that's contributed, the lower dollar's contributed to higher exports. And of course you've seen the beginnings of a very big upswing in housing construction, which we need. So I think all the things you would expect monetary policy to do, actually, it's done.
Now, housing seems to be propping up the New South Wales budget surplus today. Are you comfortable that the main stimulus seems to be through a housing boom?
Well, I don't think it's the main stimulus. It's very important. We've had a 9% upswing in housing construction. That's quite important. It's probably not as important as the increase in household consumption. On your point about Sydney house prices, well, there's no doubt the Reserve Bank's job would be much easier if we didn't have inflation in Sydney house prices to the extent we do. But and I'd vastly prefer not to see it. But we also recognise, of course, that monetary policy is a trade-off, and in order to get the other benefits from lower interest rates, we've had to accept inflation in Sydney house prices.
Generally, household spending and confidence has been pretty poor, hasn't it? What is the evidence for real improvements in household consumption?
Well, I'm not sure that's so. I mean, the numbers are just irrefutable partly in retail sales, but more importantly in our national accounts. They show that household consumption spending in real terms has been increasing faster than GDP. From memory, something like 2.8% through the year to March in real terms. Pretty good.
Just on infrastructure, in the New South Wales budget today, the Baird government's decision is to plough a lot of money into infrastructure. Is that the right decision?
Well, what I would say is that the more we can be doing on infrastructure, providing it's sensible, providing it's into projects that will have a good social or commercial return, the more we do, the better. At this point, we've got very low borrowing rates nationally, internationally. And we've got a lot to do. So the specific decisions in New South Wales I wouldn't comment on, but I would say the more we can be doing on infrastructure that's sensible right now, the better.
You've argued that big infrastructure decisions need strong leadership of the likes of Hawke and Keating and Howard, but we don't seem to be within cooee of that sort of leadership. Isn't that going to cause problems?
Well, what I would argue is that we do need to confirm the authority of Infrastructure Australia to independently advise all governments, state and federal, of the of what's worth doing in infrastructure and what's not. To be able to give us a list of priorities that is subject to clear cost-benefit analysis.
But will Infrastructure Australia be able to deliver independent views? It is subject to ministerial discretion.
Well, we've yet to see. I think they probably will. I think we are. We've seen the preliminary papers. I think we're likely to see that before the end of the year.
And what sort of reform agenda is achievable now, given the aftertaste of the first Abbott budget?
Well, it's very, very important to eliminate the deficit in current spending and current taxes, and I'm not sure it's quite as hard to do as we think. If you look at the intergenerational report, the scale of the task, it's formidable, but it's not insuperable, and we can get there. We can get there, in my view, for example, by removing concessionality from capital gains, by removing some of the concessionality from high income earners in superannuation. These are important and useful changes. I think it's been good that the government has been able to reach agreement with the Greens to make a part pension a bit harder to get for people with adequate assets and income. We don't need very many more of these to actually close the gap.
And just moving to the US and the possible rate rise over there, Janet Yellen seems to be more nervous about what this might do for markets. When do you think a rate rise could happen?
Well, I've been wrong right along. I thought they would have done it already. It looks like it'll be the end of this year, conceivably early next. When they do it, it'll be to our advantage, I think, because it'll weigh a bit on the Australian dollar, or the US dollar will, I hope, appreciate a little bit. So that'll be good for us, and I think they'll be very gentle.
And John, how do you see Australia travelling, say, this time next year?
Well, I'd like to think it's in a better place. I'd like to think in a year's time we would have seen a little more strength in investment. I would like to think that growth would be a little stronger than it is now. And I would like to see the Australian dollar a little lower than it is now. If we had those three outcomes in a year's time, that would be very satisfactory.
John Edwards, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Tiggy.